Foundation. And by MCI, providing full telecommunications service to businesses and homes across the U.S. and around the world.
The Texas Debates. The 1990 gubernatorial primaries. Tonight, the Democrats.
Good evening, I'm Bob Ray Sanders. Welcome to the Texas Debates, produced and presented by KERA-TV, WFAA-TV, the Dallas Morning News, and Texas Monthly. Tonight we bring you the major Democratic candidates in the 1990 governor's race. State Treasurer Ann Richards, former Governor Mark White, and Attorney General Jim Maddox. The order for questions and closing statements was determined by a drawing with the candidates' representatives. The format for the debate is that each candidate will have 1 minute, 30 seconds to respond to a question and 40 seconds to respond to a follow-up question. The three opponents will then have 45 seconds each to give rebuttal. There will be 4 such rounds. Then each candidate will have 2 minutes to make their closing statements. Time cues will be given by lights on the cameras. Now, let me introduce you to our other panelists. Paul Burka, executive editor of Texas Monthly Magazine, Cindy Kennard, political correspondent for WFAA-TV, and Wayne Slater from the Austin Bureau of the Dallas Morning News. I will have the first question from Ms. Richards. Ms. Richards, during the last televised debate, you made an apparent slip of the tongue by suggesting that no one should determine whether a, quote, white woman should have an abortion. It was later revealed, of course, that in 1974 that you had given a speech using the term wetback. In light of these two examples, how do you convince the Texas electorate, particularly minority voters, that these were merely slips of the tongue and not evidence of a more severe character flaw, namely racism?
Bob Ray, of course, I've known you for a long time and a lot of people in Dallas for a long time because I really began working in civil rights activities and working in civil rights politics when I lived here in Dallas many, many years ago. My first race for governor was to support Henry B. Gonzalez, who at that time was running for governor, and the only place we could find to work that would take the efforts of a Hispanic candidate was the NAACP headquarters, and I was there. I marched in the Valley on the first Farm Workers March. My agency employs more minorities in promotion, in hiring, does more minority purchasing than any other agency in the state of Texas. I sincerely regret that in the first debate there was a question of what I had said. I really believe that in the issue of abortion, the question is that no one should determine whether or why a woman should have an abortion, and she should seek whatever counsel is necessary for her to seek that would give her comfort.
Despite your record, I mean, at least one member of the panel running against you here, perhaps both, have made quite political hay out of those statements. Do you blame them for that, or is what's happening right now really your responsibility for running perhaps a flawed campaign?
Well, I think we always have to assume responsibility, Bob Ray, but I also think that everyone on this group of 3 understands my record, some of them longer than others. And I think that it is unfortunate that the campaign takes a tenor that has nothing to do really with the future of Texas and what we're going to do and attempts to become some personal kind of smear campaign. My record in civil rights, my belief in individual rights is a long one, is a strong one, and I'm very, very proud of it.
All right, Mr. White, rebuttal.
You know, the night of the last debate when those remarks were made, I said at that time that I didn't think that she meant that, and I think that she owes the state a report on what she really meant, and I think she just made that. I think your explanation was fair, I think it was honest, and I don't think there's a racist bone in your body.
Thank you.
Mr. Maddox?
Ann, I don't think that you're a racist by any stretch of the imagination. I think that the problem that developed was that after that statement, you waited a very long time to make very clear what your position was. You did not respond to the press for 3 or 4 days, as a matter of fact. And I think that that was the big problem. I've known you for a long time, and I don't think that you feel that way. And I'm just glad we've managed to clear that up now.
Okay, Mr. Burkert, your question for Mr. White.
Mr. White, I'd like to ask what you think you learned from your defeat in 1986. Legislators criticized you at the time for not making commitments and not sticking to the ones that you'd made. Bill Clements criticized you for bad staff. Maybe that's a badge of honor, but at any rate, and for your management of the governor's office, it was an issue in your last campaign. And you had a reputation for not getting involved in issues until others had done the work and it was time to claim the credit. Indigent health care, for example, comes to mind. Now, how is it going to be different this time around?
Well, I think it's different from the way you characterized it last time around, Paul. I think you'll have to admit that times were dramatically different. At the time that I was holding office as governor, the price of oil was dropping, our revenues were falling, and we were faced with very critical issues about the future of Texas. Which way will we go? Did we have the courage to go forward, or were we going to retreat? And I think that's one of the differences we have with both of my opponents who criticized me for raising revenues during that period of time. They can't have it both ways. You either have to pay for these schools and roads that we want, or you don't get the schools and roads. And I presume from what they've accused me of doing that you just don't get the schools and roads. What we did was made a decision for Texas to go forward, building roads and schools, making this state a better place to live. The fact that we work with the legislature, I think, is demonstrated by the enormous amount of legislation that was passed, dramatic legislation that had never been passed before. It ranges from what we just talked about on education to unemployment compensation and for farm workers, a dramatic array of legislation that passed during that period of time to a water plan for Texas. So I think that the record speaks louder than those words, and I think the record's clear. During the 4 years that I was governor, we managed to do quite well in the toughest of times and move the state forward. I intend to do that again.
Well, Mr. White, what do you think was the worst mistake that you made in your term? I mean, were there mistakes made and by you, and what mistake do you think there were? What would be different this time?
Obviously, we did not have a perfect administration. I've had that pointed out to me on many occasions about teachers across Texas, and certainly there are many things we would change. We would work more closely to see that young teachers are going to be brought into the profession. They're going to be the best trained and best prepared teachers. We're going to take care of those who are there and put them on the centerpiece to let them know that that's the way our new economy is going to be developed. We didn't do that at the first time, and I'll assure you right now that I've learned my lesson. My daddy never had to spank me twice for the same thing.
Mr. Maddox, your rebuttal.
Well, I don't think the real issue is what Mark White did or did not do the last time. I think we have a great number of problems still facing the state that would be better off had additional planning been done for the state. I think my real disagreement with you, Mark, is that you regard raising taxes as an act of courage. But there are about 17 million Texans out there that just don't happen to agree with you about that. I think that had we been a lot tougher in managing the budget of Texas, we would have done a lot better job and kept taxes much lower. I'll try to provide strong leadership as governor to make sure that we do the kind of planning that's necessary to move the state forward.
Ms. Richards?
I read a line in the paper the other day that I think applies to Mark's administration. It was like a grade B movie. I didn't walk out on it, but I don't want to see it again. The problem in the administration, I thought, was that the numerous appointees to boards and commissions that the governor makes are unprepared when they arrive there. And they are schooled by the staff that has created the status quo. I would suggest if you trained your appointees, if that had happened, we would not have found ourselves in federal court in MHMR, we would not have found ourselves in federal court in TDC, and the governor of this state needs to be a manager.
Cindy Kennard, your question for Jim Maddox.
Mr. Maddox, your campaign is based on bringing a lottery to Texas and no new taxes, but the best estimate still is it will only generate $600, perhaps $700 million. You continue to claim it will pay for fighting crime, education, building prisons, improving social services. Critics say there's no possible way to spread that money out. So how can you continue to mislead the public and the voters?
Well, first, Cindy, the claims that I've made about the lottery, it will carry out. The lottery will bring us in about $700 million a year. I've never said that it's going to be the panacea that will solve everything. We may even bring in more money than that, particularly if we adopt a multi-state lottery or perhaps even a worldwide lottery type concept. But I think that our revenues in the state will grow between $3 and $5 billion over the next biennium as projected. If you take the lottery proceeds, you put those with the other monies that we'll generate, if we work hard to streamline state government, to really make a difference in state government, and if we do a better job of attracting federal monies into the state, we'll be able to provide for those services that we need without raising taxes. And I believe that. I think that it's taken a lot of push to get the lottery to the forefront in this particular effort. I've got 2 converts over here with me, as a matter of fact. But the fact is that it will solve many of our problems if we just work hard to get it adopted, move it forward much faster than what we've moved the Racing Commission under Governor Clements, and to make sure that we manage it the way it should be managed.
Aren't you a convert on the lottery? I believe you told the Baptist Standard newspaper that you were opposed to a lottery.
At one time I was opposed to the lottery, but that was before we needed additional money to pay for school finance and before we needed money to pay for our prisons, and it was also before we did some of this other tax increasing in Texas. It makes sense that the lottery, its time has come. It is now bringing in much greater monies based on the performance in other states. You take the state of Florida. It brought in $653 million in the first full year of operation. New York, a state about the size of Texas, brings in about $840 million per year. And I think with that money, if you give it to me, I'll give you better schools, I'll give you better law enforcement, and I've never told you that I'd give you all the social services that you needed through a state lottery.
Ms. Richards, your rebuttal?
I think we all agree that if the taxpayers of Texas vote in favor of a lottery, we're in favor of a lottery, and we think it should pass the legislature and they should be given that opportunity. The concern that we have is whether or not that lottery is going to have a vital service pegged to it. We cannot say that we are going to fund education on a lottery. We'll find ourselves in a situation as they have in California, they certainly have in Florida, where the school administrators are saying, please don't do that because once you do, then they won't give us any other money. They say, well, you have the lottery. And it's an unstable source of funds. It's a real crapshoot for public education, but it'd be great for general revenue.
Mr. White.
Well, my opposition to the lottery has been based upon the fact that it is an unstable revenue source, and for that reason we shouldn't be using it for the funding of education. I think it can be utilized, and I have said, Jim, that we would like the people of Texas to have a vote on that issue, and certainly that money should be dedicated to specific usage, but not just for the sole purpose and look to it only for raising revenues for education. And I think that we can see, Jim, that we can make this decision based on the people and how they go about resolving the issue, and you know all 3 of us have taken the same position on this issue.
Wayne Slater, your question for Ann Richards.
Ms. Richards, crime is an issue in this campaign, and many law enforcement officers across the state, including our own Dallas police chief, have urged a brief waiting period so that police can check out the mental and the criminal history of people trying to buy guns. Do you support this tool that law enforcement wants to fight crime?
The question of gun control, which is really what this is about, has been one, of course, that's been raging across the country now for years. I've hunted as a kid, hunted not too many years ago out in West Texas, enjoyed it as a sport. I think people have a right to own guns. I have only some concerns, though, about guns that are assault weapons that could get into the hands of those people who perhaps are mentally unstable. When we hear of situations in which school children are murdered in schoolyards, as they were in the situation in California, it certainly gives you pause at the type of weapon that people ought to be able to own. I would certainly be willing to look at a piece of legislation that said that we need to determine whether or not someone with a history of mental problems should own a specific kind of weapon.
I'm unclear. Is that a yes or a no? And I hope that in the rebuttal everybody else would answer the specific question.
I think on specific, excuse me if I was not clear, I think that on specific types of weapons, but I do not believe that across the board that there should be waiting periods or limitations.
Mr. White, your rebuttal?
I think a reasonable waiting period is acceptable, and I think that we have to maintain, of course, the constitutional right to keep and bear arms. We can do that, and I assure you that I have been one of those people steadfast in the right of the individuals to maintain weapons in their homes and other appropriate places. I'm a hunter, and I believe that it's important that we not overlook the importance of individuals in our country. Standing alone, armed, are a mighty force. It is a force for our national defense. We see what one person standing alone can do in the Tiananmen Square, but he was unarmed. I think it's important that we maintain the tradition, not only in Texas, but in this nation, of a citizen soldier, of the citizens who have the right to keep and bear arms.
Mr. Maddox.
I think if you look at most of the circumstances that have caused the public outcry for restrictions on handguns and on other kinds of semi-automatic and automatic weapons, I think you'll find that a 7-day or 10-day waiting period would probably have not had any impact at all. Most of the people that conducted those crimes would have been able to easily get the guns and would not have been found to have been restricted by the laws that we're talking about. I would not be in favor of that restriction unless somebody showed to me that it would make a material difference in the kind of crime rates that we have in Texas.
Okay, Mr. White, the state legislature is in special session right now trying to do something with the school financing problems that we face in the state. Had you not been defeated, you would be governor now. Assuming that you were governor now, what specific plan would you have for equalizing educational financing in this state?
Well, I guess the easiest way to do that is just to keep the commitments that were made back in that campaign in 1986. Both Bill Clements, the current governor, and myself both stated that we wanted to maintain the same proportion of funding for education that was being established at that time, which was about 50% of the total budget was being spent on education. Had we maintained that, then there would be no need for the special session we have today, and we wouldn't have seen the loss of that lawsuit. We would have had more monies available for public schools in Texas than they're even talking about raising today in Austin. They had $21 billion more since I left office. And what did they do with it? They let the proportions spent on education drop dramatically. That was a terrible mistake. Had they just kept the promise on funding, we wouldn't be in the problem we face today. We would have done that. We would have maintained the momentum in education. We would not have to worry about that. What do you do now? I think you go back and wash through that budget, use some of that $21 billion to fulfill the needs and demands of the court.
And yet, Mr. White, I understand that the committee chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, the House Appropriations Committee, all these high-ranking state officials are suggesting it's going to take another $5 billion, additional $5 billion for the next 2 or 3 years, $3 billion of that for education alone. Where specifically would you tell the legislature to get that money from?
Well, that's exactly where you get it from. You go back in that budget and look where you spent your money before. Let's start rearranging and reordering our priorities. It can be done. It takes a certain amount of willpower, but we had it when I was there to make certain we were going to commit funds to education. We kept the money in education. We need to keep the proportion of money in education, and that will be more than sufficient amount of money to meet the needs both tested by the courts and also the needs that would be tested by anyone who is truly committed to educational excellence.
Mr. Maddox.
I think if the plan had been put together properly in the first place, we wouldn't have been in litigation immediately. As a matter of fact, we wouldn't have had a court that ruled 9-0 that the educational funding plan was unconstitutional. I had the responsibilities of defending that plan, and I will have the responsibilities if this legislature does not come up with a formula to put one in place and offer it to the court. A recommendation I've made, of course, is that we get at least $700 million from the state lottery. And I think when we also match that with other monies that are available through the budget, and particularly through the educational budget that Mark just spoke about, I think that we can find the monies that we need to bring about school equalization in the first year. I think it will take additional monies in the later years that we will get out of our revenues.
Thank you. Ms. Richards.
The immediate problem is, what are we going to do in this session of the legislature? I agree with Jim that if we had had a plan in the first place in which teachers and principals had been involved to devise what should be done in education, we wouldn't be finding ourselves in this situation, because we had a plan that didn't work. Essentially, it was a plan that Mark's Blue Ribbon Committee put together that failed. And so now we are in a situation of what do we do? I went back into this year's biennium budget and found what I believe to be $600 to $800 million that are going to be available to spend immediately, and I hope that the legislature takes that route rather than raising any taxes.
All right, thank you. Paul Burker, your question for Jim Maddox.
Mr. Maddox, character is an issue in every campaign. You are the only candidate who has been indicted and, of course, acquitted for malfeasance in office. You used to release your federal income tax returns. You no longer do so. You accepted $200,000 under questionable circumstances from savings and loan wheeler dealer Danny Faulkner. Why won't you release your federal income tax returns, and why should the people of Texas trust you to be their governor?
Paul, I have released my income tax returns in the past because I thought it was the right thing to do. In this particular campaign, I think very simply that how much I pay in taxes, or the fact that I make less money than either one of these other two, is not really the issue in this particular campaign. The real issue is how much one of these two will raise the taxes on the average family in Texas if we allow them to be elected governor. I have always believed that disclosure is the proper course, and I will make the appropriate disclosure at the appropriate time. There's only been one candidate, and that's Ms. Richards, who's released her income tax returns. There are 12 that have not. Now, when I get into a ball game and the others are playing on the same field with me, well, then I'll make those same kind of disclosures.
Follow-up?
Your fundraising activities have been extremely controversial. In fact, they're so controversial, they've become an issue in the Republican campaign for governor. The House of Representatives passed a bill to prevent future attorneys general from engaging in political fundraising. With so much smoke, isn't there some fire here somewhere?
Paul, if there were fire there, you would have already reported it, and you know that.
Well, I have.
Well, the fact is that we raise political money just like the other candidates do. In the campaign ad that Ken Hance is running, I don't think anybody would believe that $1,000 would have any impact on any of my decisions. And the most important thing about that ad, Clayton Williams has said unequivocally that we didn't have the conversation that Ken Hance is reporting. It didn't happen. And so we can talk all we want about it, but that just didn't happen. The fact is that these campaigns are expensive. I believe we ought to have full campaign disclosure, and I'll push for it.
Ms. Richards?
Well, I have revealed my income tax, and I don't have to wait until some other candidate or candidates do so to think that it's important for people to know where we made our money. I think we ought to know whether Jimmy declared that $200,000 he got from Danny Faulkner on his income. I think the people have a right to know how we make our living. Now, I don't raise money the same way as these other two guys. I raise money from principally small donors, over 18,000 of them, who 80% of them wrote checks of $50 or less. Until you spread it out, you can always question the ethics of the person campaigning.
Mr. White.
Well, Jim, there's only 11 now because I released my income tax returns today. And I think it's important that we do have full disclosure, and I think it's appropriate that the people have a right to know. I always did that when I was in public office, and I've done it today even though I'm not in public office. And I think it's important that we have full disclosure, and quite frankly, I was disturbed by the reports that there were deals made before people would file lawsuits. I think that's unfortunate. Hopefully that didn't happen.
Cindy Kennard, your question for Ann Richards.
We've talked about a lot of issues here tonight, but as Paul Ray's character is also on the minds of the voters, you have acknowledged, as you did in the last debate, a problem with alcohol and your successful treatment.
Right.
But once and for all, I'd like you to answer a question that every other candidate has answered.
Right.
Have you ever used illegal drugs?
Cindy, I have revealed more about my personal life, including my alcoholism and my recovery for 10 years, than any person who has ever run for governor before. I have told my story again and again. And now by continuing to raise these questions, I think that we are sending a very sad message to a lot of people who think that if they seek treatment, they will forever bear the stigma of their addiction, that they will not have an opportunity to live openly and fully with their addiction. And they're certainly going to think twice before they ever run for public office. So when I went public with my story, I did it because I really wanted to help people. And now I think by continuing to raise the question in the dialogue of this campaign and the mudslinging that gets involved, we are sending a very sad message to people who need help, that they will forever bear, regardless of what their addiction, questions about whether or not they are fit to serve and whether they are recovered.
Is that a yes or a no answer?
I want to speak to anyone who is watching me or can hear my voice. Please don't think that because I have been repeatedly badgered about questions about my addiction, of what I did or did not do more than 10 years ago, that you shouldn't get help. I want to tell you that the people of Texas want you to. And I want to tell you that my message to you is that you can get help. You should, because you can get well.
Mr. White, your rebuttal.
I have never used illegal drugs.
Mr. Maddox.
I've never used illegal drugs. And Mark and I have known you a long time. And we understand why you don't want to answer the question. But at least 8 times reporters have asked you to respond, and that's in the Democratic primary. If you were to be the nominee of this party, the Republicans will not be as gentle. Clayton Williams will do more than just bust rocks. He'll bust our party, and he'll bust the candidates that are in our party. Regardless of how much you think it'll hurt you, you need to respond and answer this question in the primary, because it has become the biggest question this campaign. Have you used illegal drugs?
Thank you, Mr. Maddox. Wayne Slater, your question for Mark White.
Mr. White, as a candidate for governor, you've supported putting criminals in jail and building jails to keep them there. But as governor, your administration really did very little in the way of building new prisons. And you left your successor with a multi-million-dollar contempt fine, and now we're in the middle of a crash building program for prisons that's cost a lot of money. As governor, didn't you fail in this regard? And aren't you responsible, at least partly, for the mess that we're in?
Wayne, let me tell you, the only governor in Texas history that's ever vetoed a prison, his name is Bill Clements. He vetoed that prison at the same time that I was Attorney General and telling the federal court that Texas legislature was doing everything we could to increase the capacity of the Texas prison system. He vetoed the prison. Pulled the rug out from under the lawsuit. That was $40 million that was available for spending then. He vetoed it. As governor of Texas, I didn't veto any prison appropriations. We built a new prison. It's called the Michaels Unit. It is also the model unit that the other prisons are being modeled after today. So to suggest for a moment that we didn't do anything to expand the capacity is wrong. The only capacity we had was the capacity we increased when I was governor. They are now increasing the capacity again, and we need to. But that certainly wasn't because of what we did during my term. It started off in Bill Clement's term, and that was because of a veto of a prison.
Right, that was in 1979. You were governor for 4 years during that period, and it's right, we did build one prison during that period. Also during that period, in 1985, the prison board, your prison board, recommended that we adopt a report which recommended dramatic changes and renovations and additions in the prison system. At that time, you said, we don't need any more Cadillac prisons. The result was we did very little in the way of expanding the prison system. And so is that Bill Clement's fault?
Wayne, the only prison was built in those 8 years was the one I built. The one that was vetoed was Bill Clement's. I don't believe in Cadillac prisons. Today, prisons in our state provide better health care, better food in many cases, more recreational possibilities than the average citizen of this state. Medical care is far superior. I think the people of Texas who have to foot the bill for this don't want to foot the bill for a Cadillac prison. And I think it's important we build capacity, humane capacity for prisoners, but we don't have to have Cadillac prisons. And that's the reason I wasn't going to put my name on that.
Mr. Maddox, your rebuttal?
Well, during your term, Mark, I think we built about, and it was completed after you left office, I think 2,500 beds. There are about 10,000 prisoners that are backed up in the county jails today, and we have about 50,000 prisoners that are out on parole, a great number of which are there as a result of early release. I think it's only fair, though, to tell the public it was not all Mark's fault. It really wasn't. The legislature simply would not respond, and Mark was not able to move them in the way that he would like to move them, and the prison board was not able to move them the way they would like to move them. And so there's a lot of blame to go around, and we're trying to work our way out of some of that problem today.
Ms. Richards.
Well, there is a lot of blame to go around, and I think we can give these two guys most of the credit. We have to fight crime, and we have to fight drug and alcohol abuse, and it has to be fought on 3 fronts. One is law enforcement, the other one is education, and the other one is to make sure that we have treatment for those people who are addicted. During the time that the TDC that Mark appointed was there, the total focus was in the construction and whether or not they could get that through the legislature. Jim, of course, had to defend us in the lawsuits. There was never the attitude that there are cheaper and better alternatives than maximum security facilities.
All right, thank you. Mr. Maddox, you and your opponents all on record as being in favor of the death penalty. Some of you, a couple of you at least, have gone around bragging about how many people died while you were in office. Considering the application, or should I say the misapplication of the death penalty in this state, that is to say that the death penalty is reserved for poor people, it's reserved for minorities, and 70% of those executed since 1924 have been minority. It's reserved for those who commit crimes against white people as opposed to those who commit crimes against people of color. Considering that, how can you support such an obvious racist application of the death penalty in this state?
Well, Bob Ray, you're using some statistics that are old statistics, and that may have been the application of the death penalty before the death penalty was declared to be unconstitutional. They are not accurate statistics based on what's happened since we implemented re-implemented the death penalty in Texas. The death penalty today is a very difficult thing to carry out. It's a hard thing to deal with. We have done that because we think that it is an appropriate course. You see, if we do not carry it out, there's nothing to stop family members from going out and taking it upon themselves to carry out the revenge that society takes out through the death penalty process. And also it has the deterrent effect of keeping those individuals from getting back out, committing the crimes, and at the same time going out, and it sends a very clear message through society. We've done that, and we think it's the appropriate course.
Perhaps you know of one case in this state since the reapplication, or in this country, where there has been a white person who has been executed for killing a person of color, for a crime against a person of color. But that aside, this state and this county particularly are notorious for sending innocent people to jail, including to the death chamber or to the death row. I'm wondering, considering those mistakes, how many is too many innocent people going to death row?
No innocent people should go to death row. And that's the reason I review each one of the cases very carefully myself. As a matter of fact, I stepped in and stopped one of the executions because it was necessary to keep that kind of inappropriate thing from taking place. I think that we have to be very careful. And I think that there are very rare circumstances when the death penalty is applied in an inappropriate fashion.
Ms. Richards?
I think the death penalty is a very difficult and worrisome responsibility of the governor. I am prepared to carry out that death penalty. It is the law. I agree with you, Bob Ray, that the court system needs to be re-examined in terms of the application of the death penalty and other crimes and determine whether or not the preponderance of people who are accused, incarcerated, are minorities. Because you see, I believe that what we really need to get at are the root causes of crime. That is poverty, that is education, that is caring for children who are poor, who are principally minority.
Mr. White?
Well, first of all, Ann, your commitment to the death penalty is that, in fact, you don't believe in the death penalty. And I think that people who have a position of responsibility that don't believe in the law usually fail to carry out that law. And Jim, you had an even easier answer. You could have told the people in this audience that you voted against the death penalty bill when it was passed in Texas. I've always had a consistent position of being for the death penalty. I think it's appropriate punishment for some of the most heinous crimes. It's certainly an awesome responsibility to have that death penalty carried out. And no one, for a moment, would suggest that any person who was innocent ever serve a day on death row. The system does work, and we've seen those cases where that eventuality occurred, and the reversals were held, and people were freed. I reviewed every one of those cases and was thoroughly convinced that no single person was ever executed during my term of office that wasn't guilty.
Mr. Burka, your question for Ms. Richards?
Ms. Richards, one of the biggest economic issues in Texas is the spiraling cost of insurance.
Yeah.
Do you agree that this is a serious problem, and what steps, such as limiting excessive jury awards, would you take to cope with it?
I think that the cost of insurance, Mr. Burka, regulated by the Texas Insurance Commission, needs to be re-examined in terms of the information that is provided to the members of that commission in their deliberations. Right now, most of that information is provided them by the insurance companies themselves. I think that it is essential that the rate-based information that is given to those commissioners is developed by staff and is developed independently. Secondly, I think that it is essential and it is incumbent on the next governor to appoint consumer-oriented people to the Insurance Commission, rather than appointing those people who come from the industry itself. I think that the cost of insurance in this state can be controlled. It has to be controlled through the commission, and I think that who the governor appoints makes a tremendous difference in that. I also think that the health insurance regulation should come under the Insurance Commission, and that the governor and the appointees to that commission must sit down and have specific goals determining exactly what those appointees are going to do first year, second year, third year of their service there.
Well, I'd like to ask you, too, as you're aware of the last special session of the legislature late last year, actually, passed a workers' compensation bill.
Yes.
It was opposed by labor and by trial lawyers.
Yes.
I'd like to know if you and of the other panelists, would you have signed that bill if you were governor? And in the big issue in the next session is likely to be no-fault insurance. And in principle, do you support no-fault insurance?
I support the right of a human being to have access to the courts to the full extent that they can receive that access. I would not have signed the workers' compensation bill because I didn't think that it met two tests that were extremely important, not to mention to the fundamental belief I have in a right to trial by jury. But number one, it did not make Texas a safer place to work. And number two, it did not, and I do not think it will, bring down the cost of workers' comp insurance. And so I couldn't understand why the bill was passed, because it didn't do fundamentally the two things it should have done.
Mr. White, your rebuttal.
When you have the highest death rate in the workplace in the nation in Texas, I don't think we can ever look to lower workers' comp rates until we lower that death rate. We can argue over whether your back is sore or not, but we can never argue with the fact that you're alive and not dead. And that's the whole basis of this whole problem. We have unsafe workplaces. We make those safer, we're going to have lower premiums. I can assure you of that with good and proper regulation of those industries. It must be, that must be forthcoming. I think that we can make some changes. I was disturbed when they passed the workers' comp law. They said this solves the problems. The next day the insurance company said the rates are going up. I thought that was the problem. They haven't solved it, and I think we have to go back and address the question of job safety.
Mr. Maddox?
Well, I agree with responses both of Mark and of Ann, and I think that I would like to amplify just a bit. I have testified before the United States Congress attempting to get the repealed McCarran-Ferguson Act, which exempts the insurance companies by and large from the antitrust protection. If we can do that, and if we can repeal the similar type protections in our state law, then I think we will have a much better opportunity of getting to the bottom of these problems that we've seen. I've also filed a major lawsuit against the largest property and casualty insurance companies in the world in an effort to try to stop the kind of fraudulent things that they're doing. I'll stand up to the insurance companies. I think people know that, and I will continue that kind of struggle as governor of Texas, and we'll change the kind of insurance regulations that we have in Texas and appoint consumer-oriented people to that commission.
Thank you. Cindy Kennard, your question for Mark White?
Mr. White, since pari-mutuel wagering was passed, it's been one problem after another. The system has not gotten off the ground. Exactly what would you do immediately to fix it?
Well, I think it's time to start over. Let's get new commissioners that have an understanding of what their responsibility is, and I think that we will be able to see that the will of the people can be fulfilled in having honest, crime-free horse racing in this state. The people have expressed a desire for it. There was a great story about how much money was going to be forthcoming. So far, it's cost the state money. It hadn't made any money. And I think it's been a tragic example of mismanagement at the highest level. It wouldn't have happened had I been there. It has. We can fix it, and I will.
Do you favor lowering the state share to give developers more money to build tracks, since tracks aren't even being built in some areas?
You know, the question of lowering the take, this bill was not drawn by the Baptist Church. The bill was drawn by horse racing interests, and if they don't know whether it works that way or not, I don't know why they hadn't been able to figure it out before now. Certainly, if there's some change in circumstance, we can look at that. But just to go in there and say we want more money before we do it, I don't think that's right. There were 2 applications that were turned down in Houston for Class 1 tracks. There was no reason to suggest at that time, at least in those investors' minds, that there was anything wrong with the law as it exists today. If there are changes, then certainly we need to look at them. Until we see those changes that are required, though, I would not support change.
Mr. Maddox, your rebuttal?
Well, we've had major problems with both the greyhound racetracks and the horse racing tracks, and I think that that's largely as a result of the actions of our racing commission. I agree with Mark that things should be changed. The biggest problem that took place, though, Governor Clements waited 1 full year after the law required that he appoint the members of that commission before we ever made the appointment. That got us a year behind right there. And then the people that he appointed, of course, we've had a very difficult time getting them to move forward. I think as far as the development of the tracks, I think that the tracks can probably go on and be constructed with the present take, 5% coming to the state. At the same time, I think we could change that if the legislature so wills to drop it a little bit and phase it up as the track gets going. But I'd be very careful about giving them too much liberty.
Thank you. Ms. Richards, your rebuttal.
Well, I think making some money is better than no money at all. And I would like for the members of the Racing Commission to make a recommendation, and I also think that the legislature should examine looking whether or not we can lower that take. I personally think that if we can lower the take, then have the tracks open and in a graduated way have that take increase until we are at our full 5%, that's much better than no money at all. But I think this is a perfect example in a state this size of why it is hard to start up any new system that is going to bring revenue in. And that's been one of the things I've been trying to tell people for a long time. A lottery is going to take you a long time to set it up, so don't think there's going to be an immediate windfall.
Okay, Wayne Slater, your question for Jim Maddox.
Mr. Maddox, you've described yourself as being tough and aggressive. Some of your political opponents have said that you have a history of negative campaigning. You've said during this campaign that your 2 opponents are against the lottery. They say they're for the lottery. You've said that they're for taxes. They say they're against taxes. There's a television commercial out now, I'm sure you've seen, that says if Jim Maddox's mouth is moving, he may be lying. Are you lying in this campaign?
Wayne, if you gave me a little more time, I could probably answer the full extent of your question. But the fact is that these two folks here were opposed to the lottery until I said I was for it. And then they changed their position. Now, that's the most important thing, and they were on record many, many times in opposition. Going beyond that, as far as taxes, Ann Richards has already come out in favor of taxes. And Mark White has said he will not rule out taxes. And Mark is the highest tax-raising, fee-raising, and tuition-raising governor in Texas history. So I think we know pretty well what he's going to do. Ann Richards just told you a while ago that the lottery was a crapshoot, that you can't get it started, despite the fact that the state of Florida got theirs started in 7 months, and in the first full fiscal year of operation, brought in $653 million. Now, I don't want people supporting me with those kind of negative things being said. As far as dealing with the issues of the campaign, Mark's commercials are just, that's all politics. I mean, that's just what, it's just politics. We're all friends. I will point out to you that directly violates the pledge that was made to the Democratic Party, that you would not challenge the integrity of the other candidates. But Mark, I suspect that you regarded that pledge just about the same way you regarded your pledge not to increase taxes. And so it doesn't bother me a bit. I've been up against a lot harder folks before, and so I'm doing just fine. I'm not worrying about it.
You've mentioned that they were converts. They've changed their mind on the lottery as an example. When you were in the legislature, well, you now say you're against drugs, obviously. In the legislature, you co-authored a bill to reduce penalties, I think, for marijuana. You say that you're now against the income tax. You were the author of an income tax bill when you were in the legislature. We've already heard about your flip-flops on the lottery and on the death penalty. Aren't you the one with a credibility problem here?
Wayne, again, you got to give me enough time to answer your multifarious question. But the fact is on the tax issue, I was the author of a bill that would have substituted a corporate profits tax for the state franchise tax.
That's an income tax, right?
Well, it's corporate profits tax. And what it would have done, of course, is instead of taxing the franchises the way they would have done, and remember, that was done before Mark White's time and before Bill Clements' time, before they put the taxes on all the people. As far as the death penalty was concerned, I said it was unconstitutional, and it has since been found to be unconstitutional in the aspects that I objected to. And as far as the lottery is concerned, of course, I've said that at one time I was opposed to it, but I came out in favor of it before I started this campaign.
Ms. Richards, your rebuttal.
Well, those aren't my ads. My ads stick to the truth. And the truth is that these guys both told the Baptist Standard that they weren't in favor of a lottery, and I'm happy for them to be converted. They both said, you know, they were against raising taxes. Now, listening to all of this, I feel sorry for the poor viewer out there that is saying, what are these people talking about? I have not suggested that we should raise taxes, even though Maddox continues to pound on that. What I did say in response to a question is, what did I think the legislature was going to do in relation to school finance? I said the most likely thing they were going to do is raise the sales tax, and that's all over the newspapers today.
Mr. White.
You're right, there is a lot of politics in this, Ann, because the first time you've ever objected to a tax bill is when you got in this race. Same thing about you too, Jim. Fact is, you like taxes so much you want to give us all an income tax. Call it what you want to, it's an income tax. You also reduced penalties on drugs. You also voted against the death penalty. Certainly, let's look at the circumstances at the time. I had to raise taxes because we saw a declining revenue stream that was forcing a choice between good schools and the future of our state. And I decided it was better to have that revenue rather than to turn our back on the future of Texas. And I presume by what both of you said here tonight that you would have made the other choice, because you can't have it both ways. You're going to have to make some choices when you're governor, and they're tough choices. And let me say that I made that choice, and I'll make that choice for the children every single time.
Thank you, Mr. White. Our viewers may be wondering if this is a replay of To Tell the Truth, but no, it's the Texas Democratic debates. That does complete our rounds for questions. We now come to the closing statements, and we'll begin with you, Mr. White.
Well, I think that we ended right there on the real issue in this campaign. Who has the ability to make the tough decisions in this state? Back in 1984, we saw student achievement levels were dropping by every measure. Today, they're increasing because of what we did in House Bill 72. Test scores are up, dropouts are beginning to diminish. I think it's important in Texas that we move this state forward. Let's look to see what those decisions will be over the next 4 years. Which direction will we take? Are we going to build a new era of strengthening our educational program? Are we going to move forward in Texas to improve the educational standards for our young people? I think we must. If we're going to be competitive in Texas in the long term, we have to take action now to make sure we will be. What are we going to do about law enforcement? All these people say the same things. We need to do something different. We need to put police officers in our neighborhoods and back on the streets to give us protection so we don't have to lock ourselves in at night. Let's lock them in. I think we're going to have to make changes in the way in which we attract new industry to Texas. That's the important thing. We've got a good product. We don't have an income tax. We've got better and improving schools. We have good roads and transportation. We have a possibility of safe streets. We package that together, and we have one of the finest economic development programs in Texas history. I think we need to market that program to attract new industry and new jobs and to really give us a bright future for all the people of Texas. Those young children entering school today are going to have an opportunity to grow and prosper through that school system, and then they will have a job when they get out, and they will be that productive citizen that will lead our state forward. The strengthening of Texas will make certain that when we see that 50-star flag that stands for our country, the star that stands for Texas will be the brightest.
Okay, Ms. Richards.
Well, you have to give us this. We're a lot more interesting than the Republicans were. It is an interesting race. These two gentlemen here, who are indeed my friends, have been in the most powerful offices in the state of Texas for the past 20-some-odd years. They have made us a lot of promises. They are still making us a lot of promises. I have seen the television just as you have, how many people they've killed, walking up and down in front of jail doors, and yet crime is up over 30%. They talk to us about education and how great it is. Mark would have us believe that a panacea has taken place, and we still have 1 kid out of 3 dropping out before they finish high school. We still have teachers dropping out because of the plans that were passed under his administration. We have teachers who have no say in their classroom, principals who have no say in their school because they are bound by a bunch of bureaucratic rules. We've got 2 guys who have told us consistently if we would vote for them, they would make things better. And the taxes go up and things don't get better. My commitment to the people of Texas was that I was going to make the best treasury that Texas had ever seen. And by the time I finish my term of office, we will have made $2 billion, more than all the previous treasurers in 147 years combined. I've kept my promise. I've never made a political commitment that I couldn't keep. And I'm making you one now. I'm going to get out there and sell this state in the boardrooms and on the West Coast and on the Pacific Rim, and we're going to bring Texas into a new Texas for us all.
Mr. Maddox?
I want to thank the panel, and I want to thank particularly the Texans out there that kind of gathered around your television set to watch us participate. Whether you really believe it or not, we really are friends. And that when this primary campaign is over with, we will be united going into November as Democrats to beat the Republicans. By watching the debate tonight, you may have figured out certain things. I may not be the smoothest candidate. I may not be the best looking one. And I may not be the funniest candidate running for governor either. But if that's what you want, I'm not the person for you. But if you want somebody that's tough enough and strong enough and cares enough to really provide the kind of strong leadership that we need for Texas, I'm the person for you. My record shows I'll take on the big insurance companies and the big utility companies. I'll say no to them. And I'll say yes to our children that need educational help and need help collecting their child support. I'll say no to the politicians also, despite what Mark says. Mark, I voted against tax increases 48 times. And I will tell the politicians that they can't increase taxes. And at the same time, I will tell the people that they can have a state lottery. I'll say no to pollution, and I'll say yes to our senior citizens that need help in getting better nursing home care. And I'll say no also to these violent criminals that are now getting out of jail, and we'll build the prisons that we need to keep them in place. If I seem a little tough and a little impatient, it's because I am. I've learned from my 20 years of experience as a prosecutor, as a state representative, as a United States Congressman, as Attorney General. You've got to be tough to solve the problems that face Texas. And I am impatient because we have a lot to do. I'm going to be a governor who will lead Texas to a future that we can really be proud of, and not one like we've had in the recent past.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mattis. Thanks to all of our candidates for facing the people of Texas tonight. We really appreciate that. Thanks to our panel members, too, for coming up with some excellent questions tonight. Very good, Marco. That brings us to the end of the Texas debates, produced and presented by KERA-TV, WFAA-TV, the Dallas Morning News, and Texas Monthly. Remember that Election Day is Tuesday, March 13th. When you cast your vote, you help determine the future of our state. In recent months, we have watched people from around the world, from Eastern Europe to South Africa, take great risks for the right to vote. Please don't take that right for granted. Thank you for joining us tonight, and good night.
All this good news for freedom could mean bad news at the box office and at the cash registers, as the purveyors of international thrillers face the dreaded prospect of a villain gap.
Commies were a very convenient bad guy. Without them, I fear where we're going to head. Who becomes the bad guy? And I think we need bad guys to make movies and books.
Take The Hunt for Red October. The film opens across America 6 years after Tom Clancy's best-selling book was published, at a time when Cold War tensions were prevalent. The movie now begins with an explanation that it all happened in pre-Gorbachev days. Author Gerald Seymour's new book, The Running Target, makes Iranians the bad guys. And Tom Clancy, whose more recent books have featured IRA terrorists and narcotics dealers, says he has no fears about any impending bad guy shortage.
The world is full of people who threaten to disturb the civil peace in one way or another. As long as such people exist, I can write thrillers about them.
So who are the new bad guys? In Lethal Weapon 2, they're South Africans. In Black Rain, they're Japanese. Critic Jeff Jarvis worries that this search for new villains could trigger ethnic stereotyping.
Where more Americans get their news than from any other source. Monday.
Came to get you out of here.
A Flight to Freedom.
Get in here, let's go! Commission and his family. Also, some Spring residents blame their health problems on a toxic waste dump.
And concerns that other chemicals could be headed for Houston's water supply.
I'm Wayne Dolcefino in Austin with the drug issue still dogging her campaign, and Richards takes the offensive.
I'm Deborah Wrigley, kicking bulldozers and taking names. That's the new motto of the city's dangerous building program. I'll have a report.
I'm Debbie Johnson. The day may soon be coming where patients can be diagnosed by doctors without ever coming to the hospital. I'll explain.
These stories and more next on Eyewitness News.
As governor, $1 for each and every Texas family. Now he's running again and won't rule out another tax increase. Ann Richards, she's supporting more state sales taxes, and she predicts a state income tax by 1992. Jim Maddox, fighting for a state lottery and against any state tax increase. 3 candidates, 1 choice. Jim Maddox, for a lottery and against new taxes.
Why would Clayton Williams give $1,000 to Democrat Jim Maddox? He was angry when his company Claydesta lost out on a $250 million state contract. This was his explanation.
We were hoping that Maddox would file suit. While we were trying to encourage him, he calls me and says, "I hear we got a suit maybe going." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, send me $1,000 and I'll think about it."
It may only have been another $1,000 to Williams, but it should be a big concern to us. Do we know the real Clayton Williams yet?
13 Eyewitness News is closed caption for the hearing impaired. You're watching Channel 13, KTRK-TV Houston, #1 in Texas. Eyewitness News with Dave Ward and Sheriff Fryer. Marvin Zindler's Action 13. Bob Allen has sports, and Joe Diaz with the weather. Now, Channel 13, Eyewitness News.
Good evening, friends. Authorities in the central Texas town of Buda are investigating the deaths of a Texas Racing Commission official, his wife, and their 2 children. Officials say the bodies of David Yost and his family were found in their home to the south of Austin about 11 o'clock this morning. Yost was the director of administration for the State Racing Commission in Austin. Authorities say the deaths may have been the result of a murder-suicide, and we hope to have more on this story a little later in this newscast.
A fear of toxic chemicals has residents in a Spring, Texas neighborhood asking questions about a nearby small chemical company. Residents in Lexington Woods say that several young people began having seizures 2 years ago, and the seizures have not been limited to just those people. Christy Myers reports.
Next thing I knew, then I was in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, and I was
Patty Watson began having brain seizures 2 years ago. So did her neighbor, Tim Patterson.
I had a massive headache, convulsions. I went into a coma.
To save Tim's life, doctors had to remove part of his skull. He survived but still has seizures. About the same time, dogs in Lexington Woods began having seizures.
Approximately 3 weeks after he had had surgery and got home, we had a collie dog that went into seizures and convulsions, and he ended up dying about 2 days later at Spring Animal Hospital.
Patty's dog had seizures too.
She was having seizures also. So it was just real strange. It just seems like it's too many people to be just purely coincidental.
How many people do you think?
I know of about 5 around here.
Patterson believes 17 dogs in the area died of seizures about the same time, but his vet won't confirm that today, except for this notation on the Patterson dog records, that the vet gave the information to the EPA September '88. And that's about when the EPA began a massive cleanup of the Bull Chemical site. Solvents, acids, and bases, here all being removed from this location close to Spring Creek and the wells of some Lexington Woods residents. Work here is expected to be finished this week, but what about the danger to the nearby residents? Well, an EPA spokeswoman told me today that the agency doesn't know the answer to that question, and now that the barrels have been removed, soil sampling will begin. Could there be a relationship between this chemical plant and the seizures?
3 medical doctors that has seen Timothy has told us it had to be toxic.
Clearly that's possible. Certainly all sorts of industrial chemicals, pesticides, all sorts of things can cause brain damage and seizures.
Like what Tim had?
For instance.
For residents of the Lexington Woods area to tie their medical problems to Bull Chemical Company, they must await answers from the EPA, and that will come from water and soil tests that will begin as soon as these barrels of chemicals are completely removed. From Spring, Christy Myers, 13 Eyewitness News.
And Spring residents aren't alone in their concerns about toxic waste. In southeast Montgomery County, residents say asbestos and unlabeled barrels have been dumped alongside a creek that leads into Houston's water supply.
That site is just east of New Caney near the Montgomery County-Liberty County line. And reporter Ben Wilson joins us from there to give us details. Ben?
Dave and Shara, when a resident who lives about 300 yards from this site was roaming through the woods with his brother-in-law on December 26th, this is what he stumbled upon. Bags that are clearly labeled danger containing asbestos fibers, avoid creating dust. He also found barrels, 8 barrels containing a pink liquid that was oozing from the barrels into the creek below. The concern is that creek leads to an eastern tributary of the San Jacinto River, which eventually, of course, leads to Houston's water supply system. The resident said he did what he thought he was supposed to do. He reported it to authorities, but here, more than 2 months later, it's still here. Hal Newsom owns 80 acres of land that he has turned into an exotic animal refuge. Peacocks, camels, goats, and deer make this their home. And Newsom and his wife make money by showing them off at petting zoos throughout the year. But the Newsoms are worried because of these unlabeled barrels and these bags marked asbestos they found about 300 yards from their property. They say they called the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department in December, and someone from another department came out in a white truck labeled hazardous materials. But he says the man driving the truck didn't remove anything.
Well, he said we had a problem, and I said, well, what are we going to do about it? And basically, he said, well, I don't know. I said, why don't we just put it on your truck and you haul it out? And he said, well, I'm not going to put it on my truck. And from that point on, they're still sitting here.
Newsom says the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department is not to blame because they did send someone out, though a spokesman for the Sheriff's Department says they have no record of the call. But someone did place a yellow tape around these chemicals, and whoever's responsible hasn't cleaned up the mess. Marcia Newsom says she's concerned about her children and the children of others.
You know, they wouldn't know what that was, and they'd probably poke around in it. But, you know, we don't know what it is. We don't know what damage it's doing. But the fact is that it's been there for 2 months. They didn't clean it up.
Officials with the Texas Water Commission say there are 2 other sites that are being handled in a recent rash of hazardous material reports over the last 3 months. But they say they had no knowledge of this site. They said before the week is over, though, they would. Now, a representative of the Texas Water Commission was out here a few moments ago after Eyewitness News made them aware of the situation. She agreed that it is a problem, and she's, of course, going to take the report back to her bosses. In the meantime, residents around here who get much of their drinking water from wells underground say they probably are going to have their water wells tested. Back to you, Dave and Shara.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, the word went out to contractors today. The city of Houston is back in the business of tearing down dangerous buildings and tearing them down on schedule. That is the promise, anyway, from the City Housing and Conservation Department, which underwent some raising of its own recently. Deborah Wrigley reports on the backlog and the progress.
It's a 10-acre eyesore on the North Freeway, the Vagabond Motel, and it's being beautified by the bulldozer. Actual demolition time, about 3 weeks. But to get to this point, it took the city contractor
about a year.
That long? Why all the time?
I don't know the legal problem that they have to go through. All the paperwork.
It's called red tape, and it's frustrated contractors hired to do the jobs, and most of all, homeowners who live in the shadow of decay and neglect. Melvin Hayward is one of them. He's asked the city for help in getting abandoned property torn down.
We'll get to it sometime, you know. Nothing definite.
And how long does that time turn into?
Nothing.
Compared to other cities, it takes Houston a lot of time. Philadelphia requires less than a month to inspect, then demolish a structure. Dallas about 4 months. Houston needs more than a year. But in the past week or so, the program got a jump start, or better yet, a jolt from complaining council members. Then the city controller suggested using $5 million intended for demolition to ease up pressure on the city budget. Suddenly, things got moving again.
But I can't get to them, and I haven't been able to get to them.
Contractors were first to get the message, and what it said, stick to the schedule.
I think one of the things that Tom said that we probably need to do.
B-Link is the troubleshooter installed to put the $8 million demolition program back on schedule. She wants performance bonds eliminated for contractors and the city paperwork reduced.
We feel that if we can do something about the bottlenecks in the system, make the contractors more accountable for the work that they perform in the city, I think we'll see some improvements in the program.
Enough improvement, she says, to meet a July 1st deadline. That means about 2,000 buildings will have to be torn down in the next few months. It's a big goal, but one the department says it intends to meet, or know the reason why. Deborah Wrigley, 13 Eyewitness News.
Well, as we told you just a few moments ago, officials in the central Texas town of Buda this evening are investigating the deaths of a Texas Racing Commission official, his wife, and their 2 children.
Reporter Ann Whitworth from our sister station KVUE in Austin has been covering that story, and she joins us now from Buda with the latest. Ann?
That's right, Shara and Dave. The bodies of the Yost family were found here at their home at 108 Killdeer in Hays County just after 11 this morning. When David Yost failed to show up for work as Director of Administration at the Texas Racing Commission, a co-worker alerted authorities. A constable came out to the house, forced his way in, and there he found the 4 bodies. All of them were dead of gunshot wounds. The mother and daughter were in the master bedroom, the boy in another bedroom, and Mr. Yost in the hallway. The 4 have been positively identified as 41-year-old David Lee Yost, his 35-year-old wife Susan, who worked at the Railroad Commission, their 10-year-old son Eric, and 5-year-old daughter Lauren. It's believed they've been dead for at least a couple of days. Officials here have not yet confirmed the circumstances surrounding their deaths, but a revolver was found at the scene, and an autopsy of the 4 will take place tomorrow morning around 9 in Austin, and we'll know better then. Meanwhile, the neighborhood of Leisure Woods here is in total shock. This family was apparently very friendly, and they never saw any signs of trouble. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Ann Whitworth reporting from KVUE in Austin.
Well, coming up on Eyewitness News, Ann Richards takes a political swing at her 2 major rivals, and the Felix Fraga School Board appointment goes before the court.
A jury is chosen to hear arguments against the former National Security Advisor. And in sports, a college basketball team must decide whether to carry on.
Mrs. Barry.
It's a question that's been dogging Ann Richards' gubernatorial campaign for weeks now, and it's a question that she has refused to answer. And today, as political pundits in Austin were weighing the damage the issue was doing to that one-time Democratic frontrunner, the candidate went on the offensive. Wayne Dolcefino reports from Austin.
Have you ever used illegal drugs?
Ann Richards has long since admitted she's a recovering alcoholic, but during last week's gubernatorial debate in Dallas, she would not answer the drug question. Her opponents smelled blood.
Mark and I have known you a long time, and we understand why you don't want to answer the question.
Hello, Walter.
Hello, sweetheart.
4 days later, the drug question was threatening to consume the campaign. It was no longer just a drug issue, it was one of integrity. Why wouldn't Richards be honest one way or the other? She had tears welling in her eyes as she defended her no-comment position.
Because no question has been raised in all of this about my competence, about my ability, about my honesty, and my ability to be the governor of the state of Texas. That has not been raised at all. I feel very sincerely that the continuing dialogue is very destructive. It is destructive for me. It is destructive for other people out there who might seek treatment, because what you are doing and what it continues to do is to raise the question of whether or not you can ever put your treatment and your addiction behind you. And I intend to do that, and I'm going to do that.
Richards attempted to turn the tables, suggesting both her opponents have gotten rich in office, selling their power. But reporters wanted to talk drugs. The treasurer did seem to answer the illegal drug question when it was posed another way. Have you ever committed a felony, she was asked.
Not to my knowledge.
But then Richards was reminded that at the Department of Public Safety, aspiring state police officers are required to answer the very same drug question as a condition of employment. Her answer?
Well, I would hope that it would not exclude them from employment.
Will the drug issue stick to Richards in the final days of the spring campaign? It remains to be seen. But you can bet the question will be asked at least one more time later this week at the final Democratic debate in Dallas. Wayne Dolcefino, 13 Eyewitness News, Austin.
Running dispute could soon be over between a local civic association and a private company that was contracted by the state parole board to rehabilitate prisoners. Bob Boudreau reports the Prycor company has agreed to look for a replacement site for its very unwelcomed South Main Street facility.
When this old motel on South Main Street was converted to a reintegration facility for parolees by a private company contracted to the state, the local civic association immediately protested. It wasn't that the South Main Center Association opposed the literacy training, the vocational training, and the substance abuse program offered by Prycor to 200 men who would reside there for up to 3 months each. Rather, it was the familiar cry of, "What's this thing doing in my backyard?" Since then, there has been no dialogue and much animosity between the parties. But now that's changed. The Prycor president, Gil Walker, has met with some local council members and the president of the local association to work things out.
We had gone through about a 2-year period of not talking, fighting across the table, public hearings, trying to go to Austin. And Mr. Walker is relatively new to the corporation as their president, and he reached out to us, and we agreed to start talking again.
That talking has seen Prycor agree to move this facility to another, more suitable and mutually acceptable location.
We're looking at some areas where we think that the community would accept what it is that we're trying to do, because that's number one. And then number two, where the property might be conducive from an aesthetic point of view for treating adults and juveniles.
Some city council members will be watching closely.
We told them that as they make plans to move from South Main, we want to make sure the same thing doesn't happen in another part of the city.
I don't want any prisoner pre-release facilities or halfway houses located in areas without the consent and support of the people in the area.
We'd love to have the community support and have them embrace what it is we're trying to do, because it's all about problem.
So from all indications, this facility is going elsewhere. Where and how soon are directly dependent upon Prycor's ability to find that location that meets its needs without incurring the displeasure of the locals. Given recent history, that job could be as difficult as the reintegration of the men in this facility back into the societal mainstream. Bob Boudreau, 13 Eyewitness News.
Bank robber got away with several $1,000s today when he held up the Galleria area bank this afternoon. Charter Bank, located in the 5400 block of Westheimer, was robbed shortly before 3 this afternoon. Police detectives said the man pointed a gun at a clerk, said, "Give me the money, I don't want to hurt anybody." After the clerk handed over several $1,000s, the robber left out a side door. Police have not released a detailed description of the suspect, but they're hoping that a bank video camera caught the man in the act. That tape is now being reviewed by police officers. A construction worker was struck and killed this afternoon while surveying a stretch of highway. It happened about 2:30 in the 1400 block of Highway 6 out in far west Houston. Police say the victim was surveying in the center section of the road.